and still trying to figure out what it is that I think I understand. It's continual trial and learning, which I think will come out from the presentation. So in terms of just, giving a background of me, I'll let it unfold in the presentation.
Okay, and just to remind people to enter in the chat box any information that you might want or questions you might have from Gene, and any references you want to share and where you're from. Okay, I'm done with that. I'm done with that speech.
And I told Deanna that she can monitor the chat for questions because I can't present and look at the chat room at the same time. And she can interrupt me wherever she thinks it's appropriate, and I'll answer the questions. I'm pretty sure I won't get lost in the midst of the presentation.
Okay, sounds good.
So can you start the recording?
I can, I have. We're ready to go.
Okay. So what I'd like to do is I'd like to offer you a story about where I am after, in the process of telling you how it is that I got here. So imagine for a moment that you get an email from me with this image and a note that says, "Isn't this awesome?" So you can sort of hold that thought in your mind as I continue along. Typically, we approach problems in sort of a brute force method. We simply want to beat them into submission and get them to things to go back the way they were, as opposed to looking at them as opportunities to actually move forward and evolve things. And this was me, all right? And then in the mid-'70s, I happened to read Stafford Beer's Platform for Change. And for me, it was, I guess, sort of like taking drugs, because it was a mind-altering experience. I have never looked at things the same since I read this book, to the extent where I meet people and they say, "What do you do?" And as I begin to tell them, you can see their eyes glaze over as they're asking themselves, why did I ask and how do I get him to stop? Because I became such a systems thinking evangelist that I just overran people and never gave them an opportunity to really understand what I was trying to do, or what I thought I was trying to do. We're having...
Yeah, hold on just a second.
You got a train?
Somebody has a train. Let me...
Everybody should turn off their mics, please.
I'm going to mute everybody.
Oh, okay. That'll be good. So giving people headaches. Have you ever been in a department store walking around and have the clerk say, "May I help you?" And the typical response is, "No, I'm just looking." Though, have you ever stopped to ponder why that's your answer? Typically, the story that runs through a person's mind in a heartbeat is, how can this person be so presumptuous as to think I need help? So you say, "No, I'm just looking." If you get several systems thinkers together in almost any setting, it doesn't matter where the conversation begins, sooner or later it meanders around to, why isn't systems thinking more broadly adopted in the world? And they never seem to arrive at the right answer. And the right answer is, as Pogo said, we have met the enemy and he is us. We have been selling systems thinking to the world for the past 7 decades, and for the most part, the world isn't buying. It isn't buying because of what we have done with it and what we attempt to do to everyone else with it. How much of what I have to say would you really be willing to listen to right after I told you you were stupid? Probably not much. So we go to people and we tell them that everything you have learned about thinking for your entire life is wrong, Let us teach you a better way to think because we know the answer. And as a consequence, the world isn't buying because we're selling. There's a marvelous quote in Spencer Johnson's The 1 Minute Salesperson. It says, while almost everyone loves to buy, almost no one likes to be sold. So I personally, on an ongoing basis, was inflicting what I thought I understood on other people. And I would send them these models that I developed because I wanted to impress upon them how smart I was and how they should change their way of thinking. And what they were really thinking, well, they didn't care how smart I was. What they were really thinking is, why did you send this to me? If they answered at all. So what happened was I began to rethink what I thought systems thinking was. For a long time, I thought systems thinking was just a not very grown-up version of system dynamics. You know, you sort of believe things based upon where you start. And I started developing simulations early on, and I thought systems thinking, not doing simulations, was just a not very grown-up version of system dynamics. Fortunately, someone introduced me to the work of Michael C. Jackson in Systems Thinking, Creative Holism for Managers, which is a marvelous tome that will take a long time to get through, but I'll give you sort of a quick summary. In that, if you think about a system being simple, something that you can imagine designing and creating, or complex, something that you can't imagine designing and creating, but you might endeavor to understand. And if you think about the stakeholders involved in that system as being unitary, pluralist, or coercive, unitary where there's an alignment of goals and ideas and beliefs, or pluralist where there are different goals and beliefs, but they can come to a common understanding for some particular purpose, or coercive where this group of stakeholders will never agree on anything. Within each of these categories, he defines hard systems thinking, which has a number of approaches. See, what I was bothered by was, why is it that there are thousands of models and methods? Deanna, could you mute everybody again?
Yeah, but I would mute you. So I'll have to, could everybody please mute themselves?
Wondering why it was that there were, what's happening is there's a feedback from my voice to somebody's microphone.
Right.
Okay, so why it was that there were literally thousands of models and methods that claimed to embrace the systems paradigm. And it was Jackson's system of systems methodologies that at least gave me a sense of why it was that there are different models and methods. The other reason being that you can't make a name for yourself hawking somebody else's method, so you need to develop a new one to put your name on. But within the context of unitary simple, there are operations research. These are the most prevalent ones, but there are lots of them. In terms of unitary complex, which is dynamic systems thinking, system dynamics, complex theory, a number of them. And when you get to this, when you end up having a link to this presentation, all of these are selectable links. Pluralist, where the people come together for a particular purpose, and the intent is to explore purpose, appreciative inquiry, soft systems methodology, and there are a number of approaches to have the group explore what the purpose is, because until you can figure out what the purpose is, you can't do something over here to the left of it. And then you continue on to coercive, where you're attempting to ensure fairness because the stakeholders don't come together to agree on much of anything. And then the last category being postmodern systems thinking, where you're trying to promote diversity. And the thought was that critical systems thinking sort of embraces this entire realm of thought And depending upon the context, there are certain methods that you should employ to try to deal with the situation. And which brought me to the thought of, who has the capacity to understand this much stuff? And if I can't understand all this stuff, who can afford the cadre of consultants that one needs to approach a situation? So continuing in a quandary at this point in time, I began to think about this crop damage model that I repurposed from Daniel Aronson and redrew dozens and dozens of times, and tried to ask myself, how was it that I came to this level of understanding in this set of relationships? There was a point in time when a blank sheet of paper was my absolute worst enemy, because I had been taught that you're supposed to do things right, so I always wanted to start in the right place. And then after a while, I finally realized that Nike had the right answer: just do it. Because it's all connected, it doesn't matter where you start. If you investigate appropriately and continue to ask questions, you will arrive at a sensible set of relationships that describes the situation. But then the question was, if I arrive at this sensible set of relationships, how do I explain it to someone else? So that finally, I unfolded this set of relationships saying, well, if there's crop damage caused by crop-eating pests, and the crop-eating pests are governed by mortality, and if I apply pesticides, I increase the mortality, so that the crop damage causes me to apply more pesticides. I have a pest control balancing structure, and pest births add to the crop-eating pests, and the crop-eating pests, as they mature, adds to more pest births, so I have a population growth structure. And at the same time, I've learned that applied pesticides creates pesticide immunity, which has the wrong effect on the mortality. So I end up with a reinforcing structure taking me in a direction that I don't want to go, making the situation worse. And when I apply pests, I also kill controlling insects that used to devour or used to increase the pest mortality, devouring the crop-eating insects. So I have another vicious reinforcing structure taking me in a direction that I don't want to go. So I began to see that the way that you unfold this is meaningful, I think, to producing understanding. And then I had an aha moment, at least for me, was that there's a relationship between a model and a play. If you go to the theater and you watch this play and you see the relationships unfold between the actors from one act to another, when you leave the theater, you take the story with you. Because as Bateson said, it's the pattern that connects. Suppose the playwright walked up to you and handed you the script and 5 minutes later said, "What do you think?" There is no way to digest that play from the script in 5 minutes, which is essentially what we did with models, inflicting them on other people for ages, because we don't give them a way to understand them. And when people write papers, they, it's just not all, it's not a medium that really enables one to unfold a model in a way that's like going to the play and having the story unfold. So if I go back to imagine, I'm sitting at the table in the morning having a pleasant breakfast, and all of a sudden my wife yells down from upstairs, "Are you going to clean up that unsightly growth around the bird feeder today? I'm getting tired of looking at it." And all of a sudden this whole set of relationships flashes through my mind as to how it was I got myself in this predicament. I deal with a lot of frustration on an ongoing basis, which detracts from my pleasant breakfast. But when I have a pleasant breakfast, it helps me deal with my ongoing frustrations. And for the past several days, well, at that point in time, there was a number of birds outside on the railing, and watching the birds while I'm having breakfast actually improved the pleasant nature of my breakfast. So after this happened for several days, I decided to install a bird feeder. The thought being that if I install the bird feeder, it will increase the number of birds, so the birds outside, and it will improve my pleasant breakfast. And it will increase the attractiveness of the garden, attracting more birds and adding to my pleasant breakfast. So I installed the bird feeder. What I didn't think about was, well, the increased need to buy bird seed, and if you've checked the price of bird seed these days, it added to my frustration. And birds at the feeder created spillage, which increased the need to buy bird seed, adding to my frustration. And it promotes unsightly growth, which increases my frustration. And the spillage attracts rodents, which I have to figure out how to deal with, which is more frustration. And the bird feeder attracts squirrels, which decreases the birds at the feeder, increases the need to buy bird seed, increases the spillage, and all adds to my frustration. And as of late, the birds are now pooping all over the railing, and I have to figure out how to clean this up. So if I unfold this model in this fashion, one begins to sense the set of relationships as opposed to being overloaded by trying to consume an elephant in one bite, which just doesn't work well. So I began to rethink all of the models that I had created, which will probably take me another lifetime. And looking at how it is that we envision the future, so that, well, they usually go away. Oh, there it is. If I begin with the current situation, and there's a desired situation which creates a gap, and gaps we find difficult to deal with, so we attempt to understand the situation, develop a strategy, do an adoption of that strategy to move the current situation in the direction of the desired situation. And when the gap gets to zero, we're home free and we have succeeded. What we seldom realize is that the understanding typically evolves the desired situation, and we end up with scope creep, which is a vicious reinforcing cycle that we typically don't plan to deal with. The difference between the desired situation and the current situation, if it lasts for an extended period of time, tends to create a pressure to settle for less, which diminishes the desired situation. This is what happens to people that decide to go on a diet on January 1st and want to lose 20 pounds. And after they reach a plateau at 10 for 2 months, decide that 10 is enough. So if you reduce the gap to zero because you change the desired situation, then you're home free and you don't need to do anything. So additionally, we typically are not aware of the complex and complicated nature of what it is that we're dealing with. Our understanding is minuscule compared to what it should be. And seldom are we aware of the time and space separation of cause and effect. So what happens is that when we do the adoption, we create unintended consequences, which makes the current situation worse or creates new problems in the process that someone needs to figure out how to deal with. You've probably heard the comment that the majority of today's problems are the direct result of yesterday's solutions. It's just because we are terrible at developing systemic solutions to situations. When we get to a point of thinking we have figured out the answer, we stop thinking and begin implementing, as opposed to looking for, in advance, disaster avoidance, so that we look, as part of developing the strategy, we also develop approaches to mitigating unintended consequences before they happen. And to an extent, we can get better at it, though we can't. I mean, there are always a potential for things that we can't plan on, but we can develop systems to be resilient so that we don't end up in this situation to the extent that we currently do. So in the process of doing the adoption, we also do the disaster avoidance. And we begin to develop approaches to things which are better than we have in the past. And while this is a thought about how to develop or think about the evolution, this isn't the way to go about actually doing it. What happens is that when you begin with the situation, the first step is to figure out who the stakeholders are. From the perspective of how many people do you know that wash their rental cars? It's a question of ownership. So that if you're going to develop an approach to dealing with a situation that you want to be successful and persist for any period of time, the relevant stakeholders have to be involved and thinking about the implications, the ideal alternative, continuing to look at what we're doing and understand the assumptions that we are making in the process, and this gap that creates. Then the stakeholders look at assumptions. You have to look at the trends as to how we got here. You have to develop a model of the relationships that are relevant. You then go ahead and figure out the rest of the components associated with the situation. You develop a strategy, adopt a new model and a new set of trends, and the model and the trends give you a sense of what it is that you should monitor on an ongoing basis to ensure that you don't get caught in this unexpected consequence situation, because you're continually looking at the situation. I mean, typically when a situation arises that we know that we have to deal with, we sort of say, well, how did this happen? Well, it's actually happened for a long period of time, slowly, until it gets to a magnitude that gathers our attention. And then we beat it back into submission. We don't actually dissolve the problem and solve it. We beat it back into submission so that we can go pay attention to something else that has come up higher on our radar. And because we didn't actually solve the problem, it will come back. And we will deal with the same problem over and over and over again, simply because we never solved the problem. Though my comment about developing models for other people and sharing them, and sort of, I said, inflicting on them, even though I've gotten to a point of deciding to tell stories, there's a problem. And that is the Heath Brothers have written several marvelous books with one thought in mind. They wrote the Switch and Stick and Moments, that I can't convince you of anything. So why am I doing this presentation? I think I'm being a little incongruent here. So if you want somebody to understand something, you can change your mind, but the best that I can do is provoke thought. And the last book they wrote sort of distills down into this image. You present a clear insight compressed in time and allow you to discover the reality on your own, as opposed to me trying to tell you what it is. Because if I try to tell you what it is, I'm back to what I started at the beginning. I'm trying to sell it to you. And it's what's currently causing me great consternation, because how do I do a presentation that's not selling? I'm sort of working on an ongoing basis. So back to this, what's the real problem? I presented this as a story, which I think everyone I've presented it to date has sort of connected with the story. Though the question is, where's the real problem? Is it the unsightly growth? Is it the spillage? Is it the rodents? Is it the bird poop, the squirrels, the cost of bird seed? Where's the real problem? So I ask you to think about that, because I'm not going to tell you what the real problem is. So, the road less traveled. Seek greater understanding, but do not expect greater detail. There are many, by virtue of their passivity, dependence, fear, and laziness, seek to be shown every inch of the way and have it demonstrated to them that each step will be safe and worth their while. This cannot be done. For the journey of spiritual growth requires courage and initiative and independence of thought and action. While the words of the prophets and the assistance of grace are available, the journey must still be traveled alone. No teacher can carry you there. There are no preset formulas. Rituals are only learning aids. They are not the learning. I find this so meaningful in terms of, Forrester said people learn from creating their own models, not investigating other people's models. And the number of people that I know that actually spend time creating models on an ongoing basis, I can probably count on two hands. And I don't know how somebody can claim to be a systems thinker without actually building models. You have to sit down and investigate the relationships, whether it's a qualitative model. I think there is a lot that one can learn from developing qualitative models until you get to a point of asking questions like how long or how much or when, or something that requires more specificity. And then it's essential to do simulation modeling, which is the only thing that gets you closer to those dimensions of understanding. So, and Russell Ackoff, one of the giants in the systems community, I'm still sad about his passing, said that one should never improve a part unless they improve the whole. And Capra, when reading Lester Brown's Plan B, after getting a short way into it, developed this diagram, which says it's all connected. So that when you endeavor to improve a part, you have to be sure that those things which are influenced by it to any relevant degree have to be taken into consideration. So this diagram gives me headaches on an ongoing basis. And presently, I'm involved in developing what I call and. It's all connected. For me, I have distilled all of systems thinking down into one word or one question. It's called and. And what does this influence, or what influences this? And is my attempt to write down what I think I understand. The difficulty is that every time I write something down and think about it for 2 days, I have to go back and revise it because the thoughts continue to evolve. It's continual trial and learning, but this is publicly available and you can access it and wander around in my mental gymnastics to the extent that you find it interesting and ask questions, and your questions will probably prompt me to rethink things somewhat and continue to evolve them. And if you want to know where all of this is, when you finally get to the last page of this presentation, there's a link right here. And that the link will be contained in the notes for the video, or Deanna will distribute it when she gives you a link for the video. And I don't believe I did this whole presentation without any questions.
Okay, so there's a lot of comments in the chat box, but I'm not sure that there was a question that came up. So who wants to be the first to ask Jean a question?
Hi, it's Seymour. I'll jump in.
Yes, Seymour.
And I share your frustration totally. Part of the challenge of trying to move people from where they think they are to where they think they want to be is just that, is where they think. And even if you create a plan, because they're just thinking that's where they want to be, emotionally at a gut level, they really are not there yet. So part of the challenge for me is not just and, because I always ask and. My youngest daughter taught me that when she was 5, saying, "And what else, Daddy?" And I just kept going down the road. But the real question was why? And I can relate, if I want to be cute, to Simon Sinek's book, excuse me. But people need, at a gut level, need to commit. And I think the hard part is if they're not emotionally committed, although intellectually they might be, then even wanting to look at your model or following through it in the first place is going to be a challenge. So I guess my question then is, at what point do you stop them, pinch each person and say, why? Like, why are you moving from A to B, and what's relevant for you? And why is this so important? Otherwise, me drawing all these wonderful models and telling the story is of little value. So where's the why come in?
I think it's part of the and. What is the implication? All right. In other words, all right. If this is where my thought is, and what influenced my thought to get to that point, which is a why. Okay.
Mm-hmm.
And if no, it's usually what I find is that more than the why is when people are thinking about doing things, I ask, and what got you to this point? Look at the patterns that, as opposed to treating this as though it's an event, which most things are not. There was a pattern that led up to them. And if you do this, what is the implication of doing that? And then what is the implication of doing that? I mean, typically, we tend, as I said, we think about problems until we think we figured out the answer. And then we stop thinking. Though the difficulty is, as Ackoff also said, wherever it is that you initially think the problem is, through a thorough investigation, you will almost always find that it's someplace else. You take the organization who has announced a set of new products, and the sales force has been going gangbusters for months, and sales have been continuing to increase and increase and increase. And then all of a sudden it levels off and starts to decline. So the sales force must not be doing their job. So let's go beat up on the sales force. But when they investigate extensively, they find out that the sales force has been doing too good a job, and production can't keep up with the demand, and customers are unhappy with the delay time, and they've started going someplace else. There's a Ricardo Semler, who wrote Maverick. There's a marvelous place in one of his videos. He said, let's make a contract between you, the salesperson, and the company, and you contract to sell 42 widgets next week. And if you sell them by Tuesday, take the rest of the week off. Don't create a problem for us that we have to figure out how to deal with. Okay? I mean, if you go and listen to some of Semler's videos, he is absolutely brilliant.
Okay.
To the point where much of his stuff is contrary to what most people believe, but over the last 30 years, they've started 40 new companies with an average return on investment of 42%. So
I'll hold, because I know there's other people who want to ask questions, and I'll loop back later if there's time.
Okay.
Yeah,
Thank you.
We've got Rudolph that wants to ask a question next.
Hello, Jean. Thanks so much for your funny feedback loops. I can really relate to them. I've often find when I communicate loops to other people, I can walk them through one path and explain how the one feeds into the other and then follow another path. But often complex systems have got many intertwining paths, and there are many interlinking feedback loops. How do you craft that into a story that can be communicated as a narrative to people?
Well, I would do it, attempt to do it the same way that I did with this. You have to figure out a sensible way to unfold this set of relationships so it evolves over time like a story, the same way that, they have to present the play to you from one act to another because they can't give it to you all at once. So what I found is going back to the models that I develop and unfold it. In other words, rather than showing somebody the picture, unfolding it piece by piece by piece, the way that I did in the presentation. Though when I get other people to develop the relationship model, in other words, all of the understanding that develops as part of developing the model is not in the model. There's a lot of it that remains in people's heads that never ends up on paper. So even though they develop the model, they have a greater understanding that's represented in the model. They have to figure out, how do I tell a story? Right? Once upon a time, this is not a fable, I was really presumptuous, and I developed this course called Certified Systems Thinker. Everybody thought I was a little brash. But after a few people went through it, they gave me such rave reviews that I figured I was being smoked. And then a couple more people went through it, and they said, okay, and now how do we sell systems thinking to our organization? And I said, oh my God, I have completely failed. Because you can't sell systems thinking to your organization. That was sort of the whole point. And they caused me to go back. I mean, it was great that they asked this because it caused me to go back and say, why isn't it possible? And I came up with 5 quotes from different places. The one by Spencer Johnson about people buying and selling was one of them. The other one was, the first rule of Fight Club is not to talk about Fight Club. So when I talk to people, I don't talk about systems thinking anymore. All I talk about is relationships and their implications. And I had this unbelievable experience of doing a 4-hour workshop that I was totally unprepared for. I had to sort of figure out how to do a workshop over a cup of coffee. And it ended up being the best workshop I've ever done, in that I asked the 35 people to take out a piece of paper, and on this piece of paper, draw a dot and label it cat. And a couple inches away from it, draw another dot and label it mouse. Now draw this arrow from cat to mouse and write chases on the arrow. And my comment was then, you've now developed your first relationship model, and if you feel faint, you should leave now. And for 4 hours, this group was absolutely out of control, which was the best thing possible. Within 4 hours, these people were developing relationship models about things that were meaningful to them and telling stories to other people that were just amazing. And they started without any real understanding of what systems thinking was, and I never talked about systems thinking anyway. But the whole point was, in 4 hours, they learned about how smart they were. Not how smart I was, because that was irrelevant. The point was to get them to realize that they really had a capacity for developing relationship models that were meaningful, that helped them communicate their understanding to other people. Okay. Did I answer the question?
Very helpful. Thank you so much.
Okay.
Sometimes I get on this tangent and I forget to answer the question.
Now we have Greg Schmidt with a question.
Hello, Gene.
Yes, Greg.
Thank you so much for the webinar. Much appreciated. I'd just like to get your thoughts on something that's been I've pondered about for quite a while. So any model, right, is only as good as its assumptions. So, right, how do we know that our models are correct and not simply reflections of our own personal biases? I mean, I can imagine if two people were asked to independently create a systems model, it seems doubtful to me that they might both end up with the same result. So I'm just really curious on your thoughts on that.
Well, if they both ended up with the same result, there's no need for them to talk to each other. And the fact that they end up with different results means there's an opportunity for learning. It's not a question of trial and error, it's a question of trial and learning. So that if I develop a model and you develop a model that's different from it, was it the, let's see. Oh, it's thoughts coming. Hold on. People always do exactly what makes the most amount of sense to them in the context of the moment based on their current understanding. So that if you develop a model that's different from mine, the worst thing I can possibly do is argue with you. Because the model that you developed made sense to you, and the best thing that I can possibly do is seek to understand. One of Covey's 7 habits of highly effective people was seek first to understand and then to be understood. So if for me to develop the same model that you develop, I would have to be you. Okay, does that help, or is that?
Yeah, I'm also thinking of the situation where I just use that as an example, sort of a cleaner example where, two people approach the same problem and end up differently. But I guess if let's say one were to come up with a model in an organization and present it to management, I could imagine the questions being, well, how do you know these assumptions?
But see, there's the problem with developing a model and presenting it to someone else is then you have to justify the model and verify the model. If you get management to develop the model, then you don't have to justify it or explain it to them because it made sense to them. And you don't have to teach them about systems thinking to get them to develop models. You just have to go ahead and ask questions.
So engagement maybe is the key there, is what I think you're saying.
I think so.
Feel a sense of ownership. Okay.
And then, it's, the thing that brought that home for me was a comment that I made, how many people do you know that wash their rental cars? I mean, lots of people don't even wash their own cars, but they wash even fewer rental cars. It's a question of ownership. So that the hiring consultants that come in and develop answers for you is a waste of money most of the time because the organization doesn't own the answer. If you hire a consultant that comes in and facilitates the organization to develop its own answer, then there's a sense of ownership and in producing the result that they figured out made sense.
Excellent point. Thank you.
Great. Next up is Chris.
Hi, Chris.
Hello, Gene. I will say that the best I can do to provoke thought and Forster's quote about people creating their own models was worth the price of admission. And so what I want to ask about is after you did that brilliant cat chases mouse workshop, what have you learned from that approach? And have you, are there things that you've done differently or things that you would do differently or expand upon that approach? Because I think that's wonderful.
Well, I learned that some of the best things aren't planned.
Right.
And I have continued, I mean, it was part of, going back and trying to sort out all the exact order that all of these pieces came together is next to impossible. And they sort of meld together and get mushed and you don't know. But the workshop itself I probably learned more from that workshop than the attendees in terms of not selling systems thinking and promoting an opportunity for people to better understand things and learn how smart they were. Because back to what I said about me inflicting my models on other people, trying to convince them how smart I was, they don't care how smart I am. They care about how smart they are. So that if you can help people better understand how smart they actually are. I mean, there was one experience I had where the 5 directors of this organization from nowhere developed Sengi's 5 disciplines of a learning organization. And I walked out of that meeting and I said, oh my God, what did they actually do? Because it was just helping them put pieces together and asking the questions and getting them to think about things. And they got there. And as a result, I didn't have to convince them of anything because it was theirs. And I never told them that they were Sengi's 5 disciplines of a learning organization.
Yeah. I years ago, in essentially facilitating a project on online rulemaking, walked into it late and sat down with folks, and this is in the 90s when nobody knew what that meant, and I asked a group of lawyers who were running this, so tell me what happens on the first day online. And I was told by the senior counsel, no, we all know what happens, and I had to push for 10 minutes, and finally someone said, well, okay, we'll humor you. And they get started, and 2 minutes in, staffer 1 says something, and staffer 2 says, oh, no, that's not what's going to happen. And I thought, great, I've just earned my consulting fee. Have you done anything like the Cat Chases Mouse workshop again? I mean, with that kind of kickoff, that's worked?
Well, okay. That workshop was actually an accident because I'm retired. Okay. Yeah. I spend all of my time trying to figure out what I think and talking to lots of people and doing sessions like this. So that workshop was actually a high point, and I would love to do another one. And I think I can do it online, but I'm not sure. And maybe I'll get an opportunity to try.
Ouais, ça va. Un peu fatigué, un peu malade.
Okay. You got another one, Deanna?
Yeah, we do. Dan is next. And Dan, you'll have to unmute yourself.
Sure. Thanks, Deanna.
Hi,
Can you hear me,
Dan.
Jane? G'day, Jane.
Yes.
How are you?
Pretty good. Yourself?
Hey. Yeah, I'm doing quite well, mate. Mate, I appreciate you cutting out time for us here. I don't want to waste any more of it because I know there's a lot of people. But I just want to introduce myself. I work here in Chicago, and part of my job here is when new people come on board, as I introduce them briefly to the concept of systems thinking. But much like you were explaining, I very rarely try to use those words because it gets lost on people. But what I do take them through is a bit of a whiteboard session that lasts for about an hour, where I introduce them to a bicycle, and I tie that into Chicago's network of bicycles, which then speaks to the local revenue stream for the city, and then it goes beyond further and further and further. And what I basically try to explain to them is there's boundaries to every situation that we're exposed to, and then I tie that into our current organisation, and then I explain our organisation's dynamic. But with that, I do find that there is some value in explaining that and helping new staff understand the components of the system that they're working within. But what I have found valuable, and I'm not sure if there's been any sort of development on this, but there's that software that you exposed once on LinkedIn called Splash. It was a new software.
Okay.
It was kind of, I think it was more elementary and focused on a different demographic. But I've tried tying that into to the presentations, and I kind of feel like it's promoting a lot of value. I was wondering if that software is going to perhaps evolve or become a little bit more professional, as opposed to just being more aligned to the younger generation.
Well, I think it's going to stay focused on the younger generation. Understanding who funded the development and the intent of it, and I think it's well designed for the audience that they intended it for. Primarily K through 12. maybe K through 6 or 7 or something like that. And it's a very easy thing to play with, okay? And though it's not extensively deep. If you want, if you want to do relationship diagrams, then for my money, Kumu is the only thing that gets you there.
Okay.
And it's free. I mean, it's tough to argue with. If you want to do simulation models, there are lots of marvelous products on the market. Personally, I like Insight Maker because it's web-based and free. And it is extremely deep in terms of what its capabilities are. And I have a preference for web-based products because if I develop something and I want to share it with somebody else, all I got to do is send them the URL. I don't have to worry about do they have the right software to interact with it. This presentation itself is all done in Kumu with, I mean, this is a web version of a brain from the Brain Technologies embedded in the Kumu presentation. This, that's a PDF. This is, get back here. Yeah, this is an Insight Maker presentation embedded in a Kumu presentation, which is being unfolded. So Insight Maker has a very nice storytelling feature, which really, it works well with qualitative diagrams, but it also works marvelously well with simulation models so that you can actually present scenarios and have the simulation run as part of the presentation and actually step through the unfolding of a simulation model and have it run in the presentation.
Okay, I understand. All right, thanks very much, mate.
And I get, Dan, you're not from Chicago, are you?
No, I'm actually I'm an Australian. I'm originally from Sydney, but my wife's American, and she carried me over here like a handbag accessory. I've been here for a few years now, so
okay.
I think I'll be going back anytime soon.
Thank you, Dan.
My email address is systemswiki@gmail.com. If you have questions in the future, don't hesitate to ask.
Okay, you're a champion. Thanks for looking after me, Jane. I appreciate it, mate.
Okay, next we have Ian. And Ian, I've already unmuted you.
Hello, Ian.
Hi, can you hear me?
Yes.
Oh, okay, excellent. I was intrigued by the title, stories about storytelling, and I was just, I didn't quite, I mean, it didn't seem to focus too much on that, but I'm quite intrigued on the relationship between a model which is static and visual and a story which is unfolding and linear. And I was just I'm quite intrigued by the idea of what it is about storytelling that makes it easier for people to understand a model that is not contained in something that's visual.
Well, okay. So given this particular visual, simply looking at the visual, you have to attempt to absorb it pretty much all at once. As I said, it's like eating an elephant in one bite. And the connection that I made between a model and a play, I mean, the entire play is contained in a script, but it's difficult to consume in that form, which is why they turn it into a play and let someone enjoy the play as they sit there and see the relationships unfold. And they actually see the pattern. You could take the script and turn it into a relationship model of all the interactions between the actors, and it would probably look a lot like the Afghan strategy model, in case anyone hasn't seen that. Hold on.
I guess, Mike, while you're looking for that, I guess my question is, what is it that a narrative is doing that is cognitively different? What is it actually doing?
What is what doing?
The story.
Well, the story is conveying the implications of the relationships.
Okay.
So this is the Afghan strategy model that I was commenting about, which appeared on the front page of the New York Times once upon a time, which probably set the whole science of systems thinking back a decade. But I mean, this comment from the Heath Brothers in terms of having this story tell it. Okay, the best book that I have ever found on systems thinking is Aesop's Fables. All right, in terms of it presents a story that's understandable, but the moral of the story is really the insight that's not in the story. It's an implication of that set of relationships. So to be able to figure out how to present this set of relationships so that someone doesn't feel overwhelmed by all of those relationships and allow them to have an aha moment someplace in the midst of that presentation, they connect. As Bateson said, it's the pattern that connects.
Thank you.
Okay.
Let me add one. I once worked for a software company that made this knowledge management software, and I kept asking the people that built it how it worked, and they kept trying to explain it to me, but I just wasn't getting it. And then one day, a friend of mine called me on the phone, and I'm telling him about this amazing piece of software, and he says, "How's it work?" So out of nowhere, I said, "Okay, you have this large box, about 3 foot wide, 6 foot high. It's kind of heavy box. You usually find it in the kitchen. Sometimes it has 1 or 2 doors on it. Inside, when you open it, the light comes on. When it usually has food inside of it, one area is usually colder than another, and it's frozen. And outside on the door, you usually find notes and magnets and whatever. What is it?" And, everybody knows it's a refrigerator unless you've never seen one in your life. But the question was, how do you know? You know because it's the pattern that connects. Regardless of what order I gave you the clues in, sooner or later, at some point in time, all of a sudden it will go, "Oh, I know what it is." And that's what I think is the meaningful part, is that you have to get the pattern to connect in such a way that there's an aha moment to say, "I understand." And I'm not going to say that it's easy because I'm struggling with it. Okay.
Okay. Thanks, Ian, for that. And Rudolph, did you want to ask the question about the book Systems Thinking?
I didn't understand the name at all, but I think this Aesop Tales might be the right one.
Oh, Aesop's Tales. Okay. Okay.
The question is what this great book on systems thinking was called that Jean mentioned.
Yeah, it was Aesop's Fables.
Okay. Got it. Okay, sounds good. Okay, the next one is Charles. And Charles, you'll have to unmute yourself. For some reason, I couldn't get the unmute to go off. There you go. Thanks.
Yeah, okay.
Hello, Charles.
Systems thinking. Hello, Gene. Systems thinking could be called a technology. And one way to propagate a technology is to create case studies to show the value in particular circumstances. Would this be useful, or is it something you've already done?
Okay. People involved in the discipline, in the many, many, many forms of the discipline, have been creating case studies for ages. The question is, does the case study actually relate to anything that's specifically of interest to you? Or is it just noise? If you're dealing with a particular situation, if you could find a case study relevant to that particular situation at the moment that you're trying to deal with it, it would probably be interesting. What seems to be more useful to groups of people is someone that will interact with them and get them to think by asking them what they think and what their assumptions are, how they're thinking about the situation and the implications and what the influences are. So I personally, I still read a few papers that people have developed, but I don't think I'm being helpful, Charles.
Well, I guess what I was saying or trying to say was, I'm thinking of a case study where you follow it through the whole process from being there with the client to do the system thinking with them, but then to show how that worked out in the end. What was the impact of all of that, technology there that then delivered value, ongoing to their organization, let's say, so that others looking at that from the outside could say, oh yeah, I see exactly what you're talking about now, and I could apply it in this way,
Well, okay. I heard about the Formula 50s. I lived through the sensitive 60s, the strategic 70s, the excellent 80s, the nanosecond 90s, and the low O's. And all of those fads were developed because somebody did a convincing set of case studies to convince other people to pursue the fads. Though other people pursued the fads in such a way that they usually made the situation worse rather than better. So having systems thinking become a fad because there's a set of convincing case studies, probably not meaningful.
Yeah.
Well, and trying to make real change. And I think Steve responded to this, and Steve Wallace, you may want to jump in here, but sort of equating that to social technology, expanding that whole technology thought, or thinking technology, that it's a technology, but it's more like a social technology. And Steve, I don't know if you, go ahead.
Hi, Steve. Tell me what you think today. Steve and I go around in circles on a regular basis.
Circles and loops, and having a lot of fun. Yes, part of the fun of working with Gene and talking with Gene is that so many of our ideas and perceptions overlap that the ones that don't make for very intriguing conversations and such. But yes, somebody suggested, and I think there is a book out there for children on systems thinking, or should we say systems based fables or something. If anybody has that, I would love to see it, because I have heard of it, but I have not, I don't know the title or the author or where it's available. But in terms of our thinking technology, our social technology, our ability to understand and develop and apply useful knowledge, I think there might be an opportunity there for several, books, if not papers, and case studies where we follow along with a business or other organization as they learn to think differently. And I think that's what we as a civilization have been doing over the past few centuries, is we are learning to think in different ways to, interact, converse, instead of killing each other. When people have different ideas, we actually reach out and try to understand each other's ideas, because at least some people in the world have realized that we can improve our lives by building on the ideas of others.
And Kirsten's adding information that there's a children's book called When a Butterfly Sneezes. So we may want to check that one out.
Sounds good.
Yeah.
Thank you. And thank you, Gene.
You're welcome.
Great. And so Rachel has a question next, and I'm trying to catch up with all the chats. So Rachel, can you unmute yourself and ask your question?
Yeah, can you hear me now?
Yes.
Yeah, great. Thanks, it's really interesting. I like, I'm working on a project. We're trying to link up politics and engineering and climate change issues. And there's this, I think when you asked about what was the point, of your bird feeder thing, I mean, to me, the obvious thing is where's the balancing point between the ideal amount of support for extra birds and the added unwanted side effects. So I think with climate change, it's a bit like that. There's some kind of balancing point between human wealth and well-being and our management or the impact we have on nature. So I mean, I don't know if you've ever, so the question is really, have you ever really managed to express that in a kind of narrative way, that there's some kind of dealing with dichotomies, if you like, and do people, because I think that's the thing that I would very much like people to come away with is that we live in this dichotomous world and we have to just deal with it.
Rachel, could you try to reframe the question? I'm struggling with just what it is I'm supposed to answer.
Sorry. Basically, the fact that, okay, so a lot of situations there are competing goals. In your system archetypes, it's one of the system archetypes. And this is just the fact of what it is. There's nothing, you can't get away from that. There's no optimal solution where everybody's happy. There's always going to be some give and take, for example, between nature and between industrial societies. So you've got to acknowledge that, and you've got to just, part of the thing for me, communication would be, if people came away understanding that that's how it is and it's never going to be perfect for everyone, that would be a big win.
Yeah. More often than not, in the accidental adversaries scenario, people don't realize the way that they're impacting each other. Okay? And I find that the best benefit is to help them surface what's actually going on so that they understand it from each other's perspective. I mean, a small growing organization, sales is constantly upset with support because support grows so much faster than sales does. And the reason being is that the organization, if it's successful, collects customers and continues to have a larger and larger customer base that it has to support, even though if it only sells 10 units a month. And the two organizations don't understand that nature of the business, and they become adversaries with each other. And there are lots of those instances. And having them simply delve into understanding what the relationship are, gives them a sense of why it is the way it is, and that it needs to be that way.
Right. Okay. Yeah.
Now, regardless of the complexity of the set of relationships, I always find that there are one or a small number of systems archetypes that are the root of the situation. So while there may be 24 relationships in this model, there's an accidental adversary structure at the center of it that's causing all of the ripple effects that we see. Yeah. So I personally find that it is marvelously beneficial to study and understand the archetypes because, as Bertalanffy first postulated in 1937, that there were fundamental underlying structures that operated across all branches of science. And when I first read that, I thought it was ludicrous. And then after I pondered it for a while, I said, well, if there's only one universe, why isn't that true? All of the different branches of science are a fabrication of man, not the universe. And the thought was that if we begin to understand how these relationships are structured and operate, you could take much of your learning from one discipline to another. You just had to figure out what the labels were on the elements of the structure. And archetypes have very characteristic patterns of behavior and well-defined strategies for dealing with them. So that if I know that I've got an accidental adversary's archetype, I have a set of approaches for dealing with it.
Yeah, I would agree with that. Though within quite a smallish boundary where you've been able to observe that behavior in different situations. Whereas I think a lot of the problems we're facing now in the future have much bigger boundaries because, you know, because a lot of our problems are globalized. So, but yeah, no, I think it's definitely a good way to start. I almost think we need new archetypes now for our globalized world. But anyway, thanks.
If you find a new archetype, Rachel, call me. I'm always interested in a new one.
Yeah, I will do. Thanks very much, Gene. That was very helpful.
Okay, that's the end of the questions in the chat room. So let's just open it up.
Well, Oren says he has one.
Okay, go ahead.
Hi, Gene. How's it going?
Pretty good. You need to speak up a little bit, I think.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, wonderful. No, I just wanted to ask you if you've explored at all social dynamics and sort of psychological archetypes and their impact on social systems. So Jungian approaches to understanding dynamics between two people, transactional analysis, all the stuff that kind of plays out in a more psychological sense.
No.
Okay.
Cool. Not from any particular intent. Just it shows up in the presence of all models. I mean, anytime you have a model that involves people, and if it doesn't involve people, well, then it's probably not worth modeling. I mean, the social interactions are relationships that need to be taken into account when you develop the set of relationships. I mean, some people think that the model is just elements in their interactions.
Yeah.
The stakeholders that are part. The stakeholders that are part of the set of relationships are essentially the reason the relationships are what they are. So the social aspect is actually embedded in everything. And you can look at every one of the archetypes. Let me go here. I'll get there. Hold on. If you go and look at the archetypes, all right, you can read the labels for any of them, and you can see this. There are a bunch of social relationships that come to mind every time you look at the labels. The growth leads to decline elsewhere, limited resources shared by others, or more than one limit to growth, or partners become adversaries. I mean, it's Oh, and back to the comment about when the butterfly sneezes, that was written by Linda Booth Sweeney, and she has developed numerous books for systems think to connect K-12 students with systems thinking concepts. Quite prolific.
Okay. Any other questions from the group?
After everybody leaves, Deanna, I'd like to talk for a few minutes.
Sure, be glad to.
Okay.
So Jean, any parting words if there's no more questions?
Well, I thank everyone for being sort of attracted by the title. I hope you found it meaningful. I hope I wouldn't waste anyone's time. And I would like to sort of continue the exchange in the future. I find that I get lost in my own thoughts, and often sort of going back and forth with other people helps me. The alternative perspectives are really beneficial. And so.
Yeah, it's I think the discussion's very, very powerful, and it creates new ideas and new thoughts, and I really appreciate everyone's input and activity in the chat room, and that'll be part of what we can send out with the other slides. I'm just trying to see. Okay. And just let everybody know, on May 13th, Steve Wallace is going to do a presentation on messy maps. We had that to come up the last time he presented, so that'll be on May 13th. So if anybody wants to email with request for that registration link, feel free to do that. Okay. Thank y'all. Thanks, everybody.
Thank you.
Thanks so much.
Yep.
Thank you.
Have a good day.
Thank you
Thank
so much.
you.